individually. Individually copy them.
Okay.
What do we do normally?
Right, just everybody log in. Need be. That's what we need, is it?
Look the chairman.
Yeah, Jeff.
Look, could I just start with one question? It's around clearing a nitrate emergency. Is it, I think it's
We'll cover that. We'll cover that. In the,
right.
Yeah. I'll get there. People want them.
Big.
Yep, no. Yep, well, welcome to this nitrate workshop. Obviously, we'll just go there.
could be me.
Harry can lead this.
Patty's going to lead Karen and you and rooms.
No, that's all good. So we'll just, you guys will be ready. Take it away. We raise this.
Right.
And look, just before we start, obviously we've got public here. Just want to run through what to expect at the council workshop. Today is a scheduled workshop for the elected members of Environment Southland, a meeting that members of the public have the right to attend, and I appreciate coming along today. Council workshops are conducted in public. The public can attend council workshops but have no participation or speaking rights. Council must abide by a set of standing orders, which are procedures designed to ensure that our system of local democracy and decision making within local government is transparent and accountable. Anyone attending a council workshop needs to sign in. This is for health and safety reasons. Please note that the media may attend any council workshop and that has been live streamed and recorded. Seats are provided at the back of the council chamber for members of the public. Please turn off your mobile phone when in the council chamber to avoid disruption and respect of those who are speaking. And please conduct yourself in an appropriate manner during the meeting. Avoid speaking or behaving in a way that disrupts the proceedings. In the event of an inappropriate behaviour, people may be asked to leave the workshop. In serious cases of disruption, the workshop may be adjourned. You do not need to stay until the end of the workshop. If you do decide to leave, please do so quietly. So just cover it. It's what we want the public involved in this, so we'll have someone here. Anyway, we'll move on. Thanks.
Councillors, members of the public and chambers today and those online. This workshop follows on from the release of the Nitrate Contamination in Southland groundwater report and its accompanying briefing to council. Today I'm joined by Karen Wilson, our GM Science, Sam Rossiter-Stead, our GM Community Engagement. We also have a number of staff here that will answer questions should that be required. And so we've got Bruce Halligan, Senior Regulatory Advisor, Stephanie DeVries, Environmental Scientist Groundwater, Ewan Rodway, Principal Scientist Freshwater, Carl Erickson, Team Leader Freshwater, and Graham McKenzie, Resource Management Technical Lead. The overall purpose of this workshop today is twofold. It's to ensure that you as governors are informed on the work Environment Southland is undertaking across a wide range of programs and initiatives with respect to nitrate contamination of groundwater. And secondly, it is to seek direction from you as to whether you would like to see an elevation of priority of this matter over and above that which we're already doing. Following this workshop, staff and your direction, we will use this to inform action in a number of ways. In our existing integrated programs of work on farm and in and around rivers and aquifers, through continued and new partnering with representative farming groups, catchment groups and farmers, with relevant agencies such as our territorial authorities, Taumata Arawai, Health New Zealand and the Medical Officer of Health. Through the long-term plan work program and also through the regional spatial plan and the regional combined plan under the new resource management system. To achieve this purpose, our workshop is broadly structured in two parts. A presentation that will provide you with information on roles and responsibilities and current state, along with the science of groundwater nitrates, and a discussion in two parts where ultimately we will seek direction from you. Nitrate contamination is not an emerging issue in Southland. We've been reporting on elevated nitrate concentrations in groundwater for a long time. This prompted regulatory action by Environment Southland through the development of the Water and Land Plan, with provisions that target activities that disproportionately contribute to this issue. Following on from that work, the Council did further work for plan change to Tuatahi, including critical limit setting work, but as councillors are aware, that work was required to be put on hold by the government as part of last year's amendment to the Resource Management Act, most commonly referred to as Plan Stop. As a consequence, it is fair to say that we do not currently have the full suite of controls that are needed to address this issue. However, outside of our regulatory functions, we will describe today some of the work we're already doing with our communities and various groups across the region, such as catchment groups, out in the field that support reductions in nitrate contamination. We are just one party working on this matter collectively. It's fair to say that there is some complexity in how safe drinking water is managed in New Zealand, which is why we have framed it as a collective responsibility. Environment Southland has a very specific role in the system and relies on working with a range of other agencies, each that have their own specific role. As a regional council, it is our responsibility to regulate activities that impact on the original source of the water, so groundwater for the most part in Southland, but of course also our rivers and lakes. We have a role under the Resource Management Act for managing water quality and water quantity, including controlling land use and discharges that could contaminate water sources. We implement source protection through our regional policy statement and our Water and Land Plan, which contains rules controlling discharges, water takes, and high-risk land uses near drinking water sources. We assess the effects of activities on registered drinking water sources when making resource consent decisions. We can decline or restrict permits where activities are likely to make drinking water unsafe, even after existing treatment. We can require conditions on consents to ensure early notification of spills or contamination events affecting drinking water sources. And all three of those last matters are a focus in our consent monitoring function. Through our science monitoring program, we address this in quite a number of ways, and our incident response and enforcement to manage these risks to source water quality is ongoing. Taumata Arawai is the water services regulator, which means that it is responsible for setting, monitoring and enforcing the national drinking water standards under the Water Services Act. Its core focus is public health protection, ensuring drinking water is safe at the point of supply, so known as the tap. It is also Taumata Arawai that requires the preparation and implementation of drinking water safety plans. Territorial authorities, of course, own and operate community drinking water supplies and are required to comply with drinking water standards and therefore ensure that they do not pose a risk to public health. In Southland, we also have a high number of what we term domestic self-suppliers, typically drawing groundwater via bores. Now, they have no specific responsibilities under the Water Services Act, but Taumata Arawai, and indeed also ourselves on our own website, provide advice on how to keep drinking water safe. Taumata Arawai also have an acceptable solutions program which means that if you're getting the tech, you know what you need to do. We'll be asking 3 questions of you today in 2 parts, and we put them here so that you, as you hear the presentation, you can keep them foremost in mind. What more would you like to know? Sam will shortly facilitate a session with you on this, as we want to ensure that we capture all your questions so that we either answer them through this presentation or by way of follow-up. The 2 latter questions we will come to at the end of the presentation to allow you to then provide us with direction. Of course, depending on that direction, there may be new enhanced work programs that we will need to investigate, and we will bring that back to Council for detailed consideration. Do you want to give this matter great priority? And what do you want to do given the tools available to you today? We do, of course, and as mentioned in the introduction, already have work occurring that is either nitrate and or nitrogen specific, and that also sits alongside our work that encompasses nitrate as one of a number of critical target contaminants in Southland. In answering these questions today, we note that it is possible to elevate the profile of this specific contaminant. However, all contaminants have an effect, and with our limited resource base, we'd like to keep in mind about whether this would dilute focus on phosphorus, E. coli, sediment, and other contaminant effects. We have been working with Environment Canterbury and others across the regional sector to better understand what a nitrate emergency does, particularly given that it doesn't provide any additional resources or confer any party additional powers. Staff there have shared with us that it has provided them with additional cut-through with communities and may have driven additional engagement with the council on the matter. I will now hand over to Sam to capture what you would like to know on this matter.
Great. Thank you, Hayley. Through you, Chair. The question is quite straightforward there. We want to hear from you what you want to get out of the next hour and 3/4. Okay, so there'll be some outcomes that you've thought about coming into this session. You may even have had a discussion amongst yourselves at some stage. So really, what do you want to know and how can we help to provide you with that information? Karen is going to be the scribe. She's going to write down each individual idea on a post-it note. They're going on that whiteboard there. We'll then revisit that at the end of the session and just check that we've covered everything off and then continue the discussion until we feel that everyone's needs and wants have been satisfied. Any questions at this stage?
Yeah,
Eric?
well, thank you. Look, I think this is a pertinent issue to engage with, so
Yeah.
good that we're doing that. My first question would be, nitrate or nitrogen levels are increasing in groundwater. Is that a fact, and at what rate is that happening on an annual or a decade basis?
Right, Karen, is that, we can cover that off later on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great, well, yeah, we've got some science behind that, which we can, which we'll cover off.
Yeah, probably following on from Councillor Roy, you know, we know there is a degrading, well, it is degrading. The assessment of all of the things, the forecast is 10 years, 9 monitoring sites will degrade, 15 years, 12, 20 years, 15. So how do we reverse that? How do we start now to stop that degrading? Because if we, through our science now, we know that things are going to degrade from here, well, actually from 2023, I think it was. If we know things are going to degrade from 2023, how do we stop?
So,
How do we
yes,
reverse that?
what actions can we take to start with stop and then reverse? Yeah,
It's not happening.
it's not. Okay, thank you. You got that, Karen?
Positive.
Good stuff. Next up.
Do we have the ability in the science that we are doing to identify where these nitrates are coming from? Because they come from more than one source.
Right, so source identification. Straightforward. He says, not being a scientist. Next up. What else have we got?
John?
So
Sorry. Here,
Sam was
Wait a minute.
pointing. at
Sorry,
me.
after you, Chair, sorry,
Chair.
I got excited.
So I know,
Well, I've
go
had
here,
it
go
on.
ahead, Aaron. then
You
you-
might be asking something else.
Hang on, John.
Okay, it's a question for staff. We can't do a plan change. We can't do limit setting. Appendix N won't be of any use for another year and a half. So what are our options? Because I don't want to sit here and come up with a bunch of lists and burn an hour and a half. I'd like to know what tools we can use and then we go through them because we're pretty limited and it's pretty light.
What tools have we got at our disposal?
Good question. Here.
No, so the human health issue, it's set, the limits are set by New Zealand Health, by reading your document. Are they in keeping with World Health Standards or have we deviated from them or where do we sit and how robust is that?
Do we have the answers to that?
No, but we can answer that question, answer some of that question.
Okay, yeah, we'll certainly get a partial answer to that, and if not, we'll come back to you after the session.
So I guess
Hang
I've
on,
got,
David, sorry. Philip. and then you.
So I understand the MAV for human health is set to account for acute health issues of blue baby syndrome. And what remains far more uncertain is the chronic health risk. And I know that there's uncertainty about that. And that there's also going to be a lag. If there is a chronic exposure over time, it will be some years potentially before it becomes evident that someone's health has suffered as a result of that. I guess my question emerges, is there health data for our region that suggests a correlation between the health issues that we understand chronic exposure contributes to, that suggests that we may have a bigger problem than simply blue baby syndrome where MAV is exceeded?
Got great stuff.
yeah, it's sort of supplementary to what Eric was asking around the 11.3. I guess, you know, the health thing, the human health thing is a public issue. Outside of the big scope almost on the setting of that level, but how often or how is it reviewed and how often is it reviewed? To even Phil's point then, I would have thought there will be people looking at that constantly to make sure it is an appropriate level. So I'd like to understand that rather than being told it's something that's been in place for 20 years or something. So I just want to get some clarification.
Yes, Chair, just following on from Councillor Morrison's question there, we know that there is some long-term hotspots throughout Southland. And is there any data available on any health implications over those last few decades from those particular hotspots? And I'd refer to Wanneroo and Balfour area.
Cover that off.
Morris, and then Alistair.
You really just follow out from what John's question was, talking about mechanisms we've got at the moment to try and reduce nitrate losses from agricultural activities. What are the existing tools that we have? As an example, we talked about it this morning, the use of plantain to reduce nitrate concentration. So we know there are some tools available. What can we do to promote those sorts of practices more widely in the region? We've already got these tools. We may need other ones like limit setting, for example, in the future, but they're not available at the moment. So what have we got at the moment? How well does the community know about that? How can we promote that more?
You can cover that off. Yeah, great stuff.
Yep, I looked at the map and I don't think I'm colourblind, but there was a spread of red, and I understand that's dangerous, must be over 11.3. And also in the same area, there was wells that were okay. Why is that? Because we've got to look at the ones that are okay and why the difference. And this was why I started out, can we identify where the nitrates are coming from?
Have we covered it? Thanks. Sorry, I'm still trying to formulate my question. Thinking ahead to the spatial plan requirements and the various maps that we do or do not have, we mostly do have for the spatial kind of placement, referring to Councillor Gibson's last comment, of vulnerable areas. And what's the other part of it? The land use pressures. I guess I'm asking that we might need kind of a 3D chessboard to identify those pressures and vulnerable spots. And I get that kind of that the nitrate report kind of does that, but in a really accessible way so that we can plan ahead for household level. So there's that, but the other part of it, I guess, is then what requirements do we have for any additional technology or expertise for the ongoing monitoring of those situations, because we've kind of got a baseline really, as much as we don't like it. So being able to monitor the changes effectively, what are we going to need LTP wise to continue that ongoing monitoring? Yes.
So Councillor, are you almost asking for a sort of 3D graphical model? Is that what the first part of your question?
Yeah, because actually we've got a map that shows this over here, we've got a map that shows that over there, and then we're going to have to apply some of that thing and that thing to the spatial plan with our TA colleagues. So I don't even know whether it's possible. I'm thinking of my old school OHP, put one down, put the other one on top, put the other one on top, and see what synergies there are across those and what mutual benefit there can be for some of those crossover areas or whatever.
Roger here.
Well, thanks, Chair. Some of mine has been partially picked up by Lyndall's question, but one thing I haven't heard and don't see in the presentation here is related to ecosystem health impacts. So I think it's important that we've got line of sight of the levels at which those occur. I think it would be useful to explore our relationships with partner agencies and where we're at, how mature those relationships are and what the nature of them is to date. I think we need to have a really wide look at international regulatory approaches and levels and understand how New Zealand's levels kind of compare to what we're seeing internationally. It would be good to explore the travel times, particularly with regard to understanding implications for future outcomes, whether that be what's realistic improvement timeframes to work to as a result of some of the potential options that Morris has raised. And I think further to that, it would be really good to understand in the modelling that exists that informs how far the cumulative use of those could take us. So how much progress we might expect to see should those things be all implemented. And then it would be good to understand, building on Lyndall's comments, the spatial resolution and temporal frequency of land use assessments that we've got and what controls or ability to control those we have. And then finally, it would be good to understand if we could also review, have the ombudsman potentially review conflicts of interest related to decisions around nitrate management, given the gravity of the implications associated with decisions on this.
Thank you. Just checking you've got all those.
Yeah, Hay and I started between the two.
Between the two.
Yeah.
And the first part of your question around is really around stakeholder mapping, isn't it? And the strength of those individual relationships with partner agencies. Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, what do we know about movement of groundwater and how long it actually takes? I'm a little bit familiar with the discussion that took place around Lake Taupo, and they said that it takes 60 years for water to make its way into the lake in some parts of the catchment. And so how accurate is our information, and what do we actually know about movement of groundwater?
You, it probably follows on from exactly what these guys are saying. It's about the lag time, the soil type, the depth, the land use changes. It will determine areas that are going to increase, that is going to degrade in the future. I know we've got a lot of science around a lot of those things, but it's trying to get them all together to give us a heads up of where we really need to look at. You know, it's dealing with it when it rears its head. That's fine. We're trying to do that now with some degraded sites. But we need to be dealing with what's going to come. That land use change, which is always the issue, land time, soil type.
Next.
Yeah.
Striking the 3D chessboard and the challenges of getting your head around this is wondering, is there proxies or that might be more useful for us? Could be urea fertilizer application on certain physiographic zone profiles. Would that be a useful way for us to get our head around higher risk areas, and also assist with communicating that to the wider public, for example, to solve the 3D chessboard challenge?
Yeah, I would like also to understand, you can look around the world, but cannabis have all these issues. And I believe there has been some progress made in quite a few areas, so I'd like to know what the challenge was, what they did, and what difference it made, so that we're not just stabbing in the dark on this stuff. While accepting that geology and lag times can vary, but here's some things that have actually happened, some practical steps.
Right, you're going to cover that off. Some of that. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Are we looking elsewhere for science or scientific processes or methods to understand the situation with nitrates in our waterways? Because I think they're out there.
You're on the main job.
Yeah, so guys, I suppose we're looking at some different timelines here, and one of the ones I see right in front of us is around human health. And to Councillor Gibson's point around there's a number of red sites, so at-risk areas. How do we engage our community to take some ownership of that individually? E.g., people test their bores. If they need mitigation, they can manage that themselves. But yeah, engaging our community around some positive steps forward.
Yeah, look, I guess we've always looked at the regional forum, and of late we've hooked up with the surface water treatment approaches and management. What in the regional forum report should we be focusing on for maybe giving some steer on how to cope with this? Albeit that there was limit setting and such like, or input setting, I suppose you'd say. But what is there inside that report? Because that was a large piece of community engagement, surely there is something in there that we have maybe forgotten or overlooked.
Yeah, just one more thing. I'm mindful that the community drinking water supplies, most are administered and implemented by our DA colleagues. And we've been in the fortunate position of not having to get tied up in the Three Waters / whatever it's now called debate up to now. But I think it would be helpful if we had a better understanding of what those new water entities' roles are for our rural communities, so that, as you talked about partnerships, so that we're better informed about what their role is. So
Through local water done well.
yeah.
Just going to make a comment in regards to a lot of good stuff here in regards to, I think I'm the only one drinking the Gore district. But when that came up, it gave me a different view, and I go, whether I want to drink this water, just not just that's a personal point of view, but I also started questioning, why is it so high in that area? Knowing the location, and especially understanding we're only probably 5, 6, 7 k's of the crow fly, and we've got our bores at 0.8, or even pristine bores at the neighbouring dairy farm. They know that there's certainly water, different aquifers around, and different influence, different soil types, and everything like that. So I was just trying to work out that we do have some high spots that have traditionally been high, and there's certainly been an elevated level throughout as agriculture probably over 100 years, probably just had an influence as we've developed and drained the land. But is there a level, is 3 going to be enough? What's that we are in a highly modified environment, and bringing down to a level where it is, is it acceptable, or are we working that we're going to have to be pristine? I don't know. I'm just trying to clarify where it's acceptable. I think probably drinking water should be pristine. We shouldn't have to worry about what we're drinking. It should be good as gold. But just trying to get that balance. So that where are we heading? We always talk about the nitrate levels and the environment around. Usually it's around the rivers, and we're told you can have high nitrates. We've got no north phosphate, nothing to. It's back in that when it all gets nicely balanced, things grow. It's pretty bad. So I'm just trying to work these things out. Where are we? If we've got to do something. I'm not denying it. I'm just saying, where are we heading? What are we doing? What are we going to do about it? But also another question in regards to that is obviously starting to get a wee bit of data in regards to such Alpha Group doing the bioreactors and starting to do those testing. Where are they going to lead into these discussions? And I take it Pomahaka Group's probably already doing that too. So I'm just trying to, my mind's going round and round, trying to think, well, how do we get to where we want to go, and what is the target, and what is the reality of how long it's going to take to get there too. But we certainly there are some very high spots, especially when it's drinking water coming out. There needs to be a fair focus on that. So, Alistair.
Does anybody know, is it easy to filter out? It is, so where's that from? So,
Can I answer that question?
Not saying it's easy.
Eric.
so yeah, but money's money. We can all borrow it up
Here, and then we might.
Yeah, look, in your paper, you've got 5 potential sources of nitrates into groundwater. Is there any way that you're able to identify the source by a marker or DNA or something like that? Because we're shooting into a flock here, and we might miss the target, or miss the target that's going to bring the greatest benefits. So how can we identify source?
Yep. Right. We'll move on, please.
Right, well, thank you. I think that's double the level of engagement we'd anticipated, but that's great. Everyone's had a say, everyone's made a contribution. What we can do here is some of these questions will be answered straight away through Ewan, through Hayley, through Bruce, and through Karen. I'm not the subject matter expert, Councillor Gibson, but thank you for your misguided faith. We'll answer a lot of those now. There'll be some that we'll be able to come back to you, including especially things like the data and stuff from overseas, etc. We can come back. And there are some that the answer will be simply that we don't know, and not the fact that we don't know Environment Southland, the scientific world doesn't know. So there will be some of those that I'm sure we may not know, but in any case, our commitment is that we'll make sure that we answer whatever we can today, and we'll come back to you in a timely fashion with the answers that we need to go away and research. Okay? Right.
I will,
Do we now need a couple of minutes just to sort ourselves out?
but
No,
just
great.
before we start, we did actually ask Health New Zealand to come along today, which would have answered probably most, if not all, of the human health questions that we just asked. Unfortunately, they could not make this date. However, we're very happy, and they are indeed, to schedule a specific briefing to answer those questions. In fact, they have done so for Gore District Council, whose governors have very similar questions to yourselves. We know that because Karen has been presenting a number of times now at Gore District Council meetings on this particular matter. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ewan Rodway, who will take you through this next part of the presentation.
So just apologies for the part that I guess go over some of the territory that's just been traversed, but we're going to jump back to the start to some extent and look at why is nitrate in groundwater a problem. We've already discussed the human health risk that exists when concentrations get high in groundwater. As discussed, the New Zealand Drinking Water Standard is currently set at 11.3 milligrams per litre. It's designed to protect against methemoglobinemia, or blue baby syndrome, which is an acute short-term effect which can affect babies and infants who are drinking formula made from contaminated water. Additional to that, groundwater ecosystems themselves can be impacted by nitrate concentrations. So that up there or on your screens on the bottom left is some little critters called stygofauna. These live in our groundwater ecosystems. They perform a valuable role in terms of keeping those aquifers and groundwaters free flowing and clean, and they can be impacted by high nitrate concentrations. And as we know, and has already been discussed, groundwater is part of our hydrological system. So groundwater ends up in our streams, in our rivers, in our lakes and our estuaries, and the nitrogen that it carries with it ends up there also where we know it can have effects causing too much algal growth, eutrophication, and also toxic effects on the insects and fish, etc., that live in those environments. And we know in Southland that we have a nitrogen problem in our surface water also. Next slide, please. So to better understand this issue, Environment Southland commissioned a report, Nitrate Contamination in Southland Groundwater. This really pulls together all of the available information to provide an integrated assessment of this issue. It uses all the data that was available to look at current state and long-term trends. It provides information on the regional spatial distribution, so how concentrations vary across the region. And it identifies, as we've talked about, these areas where they are higher than others, which we call hotspots. It talks about likely drivers and causes of that contamination, and it does some assessments looking at the risk to drinking water supplies, and that gives us information about the human health impacts. The report doesn't include any new monitoring data or proposed policy changes. Straight into the key findings of that, well, really it's that, as we kind of know from these discussions I've heard already, nitrate contamination is widespread in Southland, and it reflects the cumulative impacts of what we've been doing on the land over a long period of time.
we can see that in some places concentrations are higher or locally more severe. And in multiple of those places, the concentrations are high enough to exceed the drinking water standard of 11.3, therefore posing a acute health risk. Additionally, some screening that was done using the locations of private drinking water supply wells found that 44% of those are in locations that we would expect to be vulnerable to contamination. So these are places where the soils, the geology, the aquifer parameters mean that we would expect that, or we think it would be likely that those places would be vulnerable to nitrogen contamination. The trend analyses that has been done show that concentrations are degrading at a large proportion of our long-term monitoring sites. So things are getting worse in a large proportion of sites. And the evidence is clear that agriculture is the dominant contributor to nitrogen contamination in groundwater. Interestingly, there was a recent national report called Our Freshwater 2026, which is from MFE and Stats New Zealand. This is a regular reporting that they do and is intended to update on the state of freshwater in this country. Interestingly, they talked a lot about groundwater in this one, more so than previous issues. They identify that groundwater is a key source of drinking water in New Zealand. They highlight nitrate contamination in groundwater as a national issue. 12% of the monitoring sites nationally exceed that maximum allowable value of 11.3 in the period 2019-2024. They also found that degrading trends are common at 48% of the sites nationally. And they went to some length to highlight the complex and delayed nature of groundwater contamination. Interestingly, we know that Southland, that nitrogen contamination in groundwater is a Southland issue, but it is also a national issue. So, as has been discussed a bit already, we know that this contamination exists. Where is it coming from? What are the common nitrate sources? We've already established that agriculture and what we're doing on the land is really the key contributor to contamination in Southland. One way to think about this is the soil zone, and we often call it the soil pool of nitrogen. And there are many contributors to that. Fertilizer is one. We add nitrogen directly to our soil system to feed our plants, to grow our crops. When that nitrogen is not taken up by plants, it contributes to the soil pool, and when it is in excess, it can be vulnerable to leaching when we have a drainage event, so when we have a lot of rainfall or irrigation even. Cropping and cultivation is another source. When we disturb the soil, we actually mineralise and release a lot of nitrogen from that soil. That therefore goes into that soil pool, and if it is not taken up by plants, it can therefore be leached. Biological fixation is another source. We have legumes, clover commonly, of course, fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and adding it to that soil pool. When the plants are grown from that soil, of course, animals come along and eat it. Their excess nitrogen is excreted through urine and dung back onto the soil. The main problem with that is that excretion occurs depositing a lot of nitrogen in one particular place. That means that there is a very high risk of there being an excess nitrogen in that small location, which of course means that there is a lot of excess nitrogen there at risk of leaching when we have a drainage event. Of course, we have septic and wastewater systems in urban and rural environments which can directly contribute nitrogen to groundwater, and they can be significant in localised places, but in terms of regional scale, they are less significant than the general agricultural land use inputs. So we know generally how it is getting into our groundwater, and as we've heard a few questions, can we actually determine the source of that nitrogen more directly? Understanding the hydrological setting is incredibly crucial. We need to understand soil system, the groundwater pathways, the geology that's there, how water gets from the land surface to where we are sampling it. And there are some common methods that we use to try and give us more information about where nitrogen might have come from. Firstly, land use and nitrogen input modelling. So we can look at land use patterns. We can look at land use patterns over time and correlate that with the concentrations that we are seeing in groundwater. That's really good for understanding broad patterns across the region, for example. But it relies on assumptions around the connections between those land use and what we're seeing in the ground, and it also doesn't give us direct information about specific sources. It's more good at looking at broad patterns. Of course, we can look at water chemistry and the concentrations themselves. We can see how the spatial, how it varies spatially across the region. That, of course, tells us about the links to land use, perhaps the differences in the soils and geology. Can tell us what's changing over time. We can correlate that with how land use has changed over time. But again, it doesn't directly identify the source in a way that we might need to if we're trying to characterise a specific location. I think there was some comments around, can we do some sampling to sort of figure out the DNA or the fingerprinting of samples? One method which we can use is isotope analysis. So we can take a sample of groundwater, send that away, and they can look at the actual nitrate isotopes that are there and assign a bit of a signature or a fingerprint. That can, the theory behind that is that the signature or fingerprint might be similar to a fertilizer source or similar to a urine source, which of course can be really useful, right? It gives us lots of good clues about where that nitrate might have come from. The unfortunate thing with that method is that the fingerprints and signatures often overlap. So we might, the fertilizer source signature overlaps slightly with the urine signature, which overlaps with the biological fixation signature, for example. So it gives us clues, but it doesn't necessarily give us a definitive answer. Another method is looking at the age of groundwater. So we can take a sample of groundwater and analyze it and test the age, and we can get an average age for that sample, which we might think is good for linking, okay, we know that that's 5 years old, what was happening in the land on the area contributing to that 5 years ago, can we link those up and determine a source? But of course, water is a mixture. When we're sampling groundwater, we're pulling, you can imagine pumping a well, pulling water from different locations. So we're getting mixed ages of that water. So we might have some shallow water, which is younger, some deeper, which might be older. So we end up with a mixture. Again, it's indicative and gives us clues, but not a definitive answer. And finally, on our list of common methods is doing some hydrological modelling. So that incorporates basically all the information we have, the chemical concentrations, our understanding of the hydrogeology and the systems that are there, the soils that are involved. And we can use that to try and understand the system or test the system to better understand where or what the sources might be. That is complex. It takes a lot of data to build a model that is reliable and robust, and even so, the outputs can be uncertain. So I guess in a more succinct way, why is it complex? Well, there is no single method that we can use to attribute a source directly in a location. There are lots of different methods, and we can combine them to improve our understanding. Just to summarise, sum that up, I guess, what we see today in groundwater reflects decisions from years ago because there is a lag time. Water from many sources mixes before we measure it. We're often measuring a mixture of fingerprints, of signatures, which is why it's difficult to determine one. Local soil and geology make outcomes very different from place to place. We know how variable soil is across the region. We know that our maps of that are not perfect. And soil plays a huge role over chemistry, groundwater chemistry, and indeed nitrate concentrations. In general, though, we can see the overall causes quite clearly, but proving exactly where nitrate came from at a specific location is harder. But just a final thought, despite all that complexity, really the evidence linking land use to groundwater contamination is clear, and improvements can be made by reducing nitrogen losses where groundwater is most vulnerable or the risks to health are high.
Current collective work program positively addresses nitrate contamination of groundwater across a number of different functions of Environment Southland and in a number of different ways. And indeed, it addresses a number of significant and serious contaminants in our region. The development and implementation of the Water and Land Plan, as indicated here, was a critical first step, responding to our understanding of nitrate contamination at the time, and the rule framework that has evolved through various court decisions addresses high-risk activities. Plan change tuatahi was to be the regulatory tool that evolved our response within our regulatory framework further with limit setting. So you'll see here that there's a number of tools and rules that sit within the Water and Land Plan. And of course, we continue to have our ongoing compliance work and investigations, responding to incidents as issues are identified and working with our colleagues in science if those are significant. On farm, we are working with individual farmers, with catchment groups, and also with those who work in this space, such as Thriving Southland. And that's through either funding support or providing expertise or information from across our freshwater team, our science function, our land sustainability and biodiversity functions. We and those that we work with are sharing a wide range of data and solutions on practical improvements on farm that reduce nitrogen losses and nitrate contamination in a sustainable and enduring way. The amendment to the RMA last year did also introduce the concept of regulatory modification, which we are currently pursuing, as you will know, seeking to make it easier for farmers and others to restore and construct wetlands, which will enable positive action to occur on farm without all of the current regulatory process. The work that has gone into Plan Change tuatahi, however, is able to be built on as we move into implementing the new resource management system, which is anticipated to be enacted in approximately August this year. Of note, we also anticipate environmental limits focusing on human health will be set by central government in the middle of this year. And this will be a core moment for our evolving response to nitrate contamination, and one that we will be working with you on how and what we do next in response to these limits. So what would it look like for us right now if we were to have an elevated priority for nitrate contamination over and above other critical contaminants currently challenging whole water in Southland? It would be working with our current suite of tools and prioritising nitrate within our existing regulatory framework. So, for example, following additional training of our regulatory staff, we'll be prioritising mitigations and on-farm solutions to avoid nitrogen loss as part of resource consents. We're already collaborating across the sector on what nitrogen loss and nitrogen contamination focused consent conditions might look like for Southland within our regulatory framework. This, of course, would then flow through into our compliance monitoring programs. There is work we could prioritise over existing work programs in our science division, including how science informs and supports our territorial authority colleagues as community drinking water suppliers to protect the sources of drinking water, and I help them identify future investment in drinking water sources and infrastructure. Whilst there is fulsome information on how to provide safe drinking water for private domestic water suppliers, there is much more work that we could do with our communities to improve their understanding of nitrate contamination, both at source and at the tap. Most critical of all, of course, is preventing the contamination from occurring. And enhanced focus could be delivered through what initiatives Environment Southland invests in, be it that investment being our staff time on farm or with groups, or through external groups who do fantastic work already with farmers in this space. Nitrate contamination is very much a collective challenge. Leveraging partnerships and working to our function's strengths will be key to reversing what is happening in Southland. And what you see on this slide is a blend of work that is already underway and potential new work. It is the work that we would characterise as working with and growing the coalition of the willing to effect change. And this, of course, very much includes our communities. This partnering work focuses in two places. So the groundwater contamination at source and then also at the point of supply. It focuses on using current regulatory tools and our science in a collaborative and also in different ways, collaborating to address nitrate contamination, where we all each play our part in collectively designed and implemented action. We've certainly seen a lot of examples up in the Environment of Canterbury with regards to that. We have been working with Board District Council, most obviously, but also started conversations with Southland District Council and Invercargill City Council. And additionally, we're initiating work with Taumata Arawai and Health New Zealand. There is new action that we could take ahead of the new resource management system being confirmed and implemented. A nitrate bylaw is a tool provided for under the Water Services Act. However, it does need to be led by a territorial authority, as the Act does not allow for this regulatory function to be transferred to a regional council. A bylaw would need to be introduced via a recommendation from what's called a source water risk management plan, which would be provided by the community drinking water supplier, which we would participate in. A water services bylaw can restrict, impose requirements on, or prohibit an activity that may be undertaken within a defined controlled drinking water catchment area. Now, any restrictions within a bylaw would need sufficient scientific basis and evidential connection, and that point is critical. Otherwise, it could be amenable to challenge, the most likely being a judicial review. They also do create regulatory complexity for the public and for those that are subject to regulation. So to illustrate this, by way of an example, so while intensive winter grazing is a permitted activity under certain criteria within our Southland Water and Land Plan, it may not be deemed so under a nitrate bylaw within a specified defined area. Now, this is still a valid approach, as the RMA does not exempt compliance with other legislative requirements. However, we would caution you in that it may create confusion within the community as to what rules apply where. We could seek an exemption from the DOSA to progress plan change to Tuatahi or a nitrate-focused variation. However, given where we are relative to the enactment of the new system, and given that the government is to announce mid-year environmental limits, which would be extremely relevant to a nitrate-focused plan change, we are not sure that this would be granted by the Minister. It would be our advice that rather it would be better to use the work that has been undertaken as part of plan change to Tuatahi as foundational, along with along with the regional forum recommendations, and to use that as we move forward into implementing the new system where the new system allows it. Now, of course, I would also note that any of this new work absolutely must and would be underpinned by strong engagement across the rural sector, with environmental groups, with catchment groups, with our communities, with businesses, with farmers, with health and Taumata Arawai and territorial authorities. Collaborative working is critical across this matter to be effective and timely. Thank you. Now, so moving to the second discussion and the second question for you all. What you have heard today, do you want to give this matter greater priority? It's not a decision today, this is a workshop, and so direction may only be provided. Feedback and direction may only be
We ask a couple of questions before we answer this. Questions. You briefed on current work, but I would note some of the things listed actually are not yet there. For example, farmlands. Not really a thing yet for the majority of Southland farmers as we imagined under Appendix M within the Southland Water Land Plan. It's coming, but to call it current work is probably a stretch of the imagination because it's not really delivering an impact yet for us. Would that be a fair observation to share?
Through you, Chair, I would say that it is current and that there's a team who are working now with a large number of farmers, and when teams go out onto farm, many farmers have started or have done work that would form part of their farm plan, their eventual freshwater farm plan. And so that's how I've characterised it as a current program. It is fair also though to say that it is a tool that will only grow in use as we eventually move forward to regulations being turned on, and that is when we will see the full benefit of that tool, in particular with regards to data.
I guess in a similar fashion, working with catchment groups, not all catchment groups are focused on this issue, and not all farmers are active members of catchment groups. There's a very intermittent take-up rate, I guess I would describe there. So the impact of that would have to be considered again very mixed and uncertain, I would have thought.
Through you, Chair, that's correct. We have found that the catchment groups that are in previously identified hotspots are concerned about this issue significantly. But yes, catchment groups typically focus on the issues that are relevant to their catchment, and so it's a more prioritised issue for some catchments over others.
And the final question was the environmental limits that are likely to be advised by central government. Is there a signal that they're going to be more stringent, or potentially are they going to go the other way and be less stringent or than what we would anticipate at a regional level, creating perhaps rather than don't go any harder than this limit that's been advised by central government?
Nothing's been released from central government as to the nature of those limits at this stage.
It could go either way.
It'd be difficult for us to assess, to provide advice on it. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that it's not going to be more stringent. That's my take on it, but that's just my opinion. I think guess we just.
So acknowledging the uncertainty and knowing that this government has traditionally been, from an environmental perspective, the pattern has been expect the worst from this government. We would have to acknowledge it may not get better. It could be less stringent, and we would aspire to at a regional level.
It won't be more stringent. I think we're going to say that with confidence.
Yeah, so through you, Chair, I think it's worth acknowledging that under the current legislation, under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, there currently no national bottom lines or targets for water quality and groundwater. The government have indicated that there will be some for groundwater coming through into the new system, but at this stage, the nature of them is not clear.
Thank you.
Okay. Jeff.
Thank you, Chair. Now, this is quite a broad question to any staff that want to answer it. And it's probably a bit like asking how long is a piece of string. But what would you do to start to improve the degradation of some of these waterways with nitrates if you had the budget? And what might that budget look like?
Through you, Chair. Oh, you go.
Yeah, through you, Chair. We've got a couple of slides later on which we'll bring those forward in a presentation. We'll answer your question right now, if that's.
Oh, yeah.
Through the Chair. So in terms of practical on-farm mitigations, there is a lot of research out there around how to reduce nitrogen loss from agricultural systems. We've collated just a few, which in particular are relevant to Southland and also even Southland winter. Really reducing total nitrogen surplus is one of the key things. So that is really the nitrogen that is in the system, and in particular the excess nitrogen that is in that system. So for Southland, applying or not applying nitrogen over winter when soils are saturated, temperatures are down, growing is slow, helps reduce that risk of excess nitrogen in the system that could be leached. Really importantly, matching demand to supply. So that's reviewing feed plans and nutrient budgets, again, to try and reduce the nitrogen surplus. I appreciate this is really just probably focusing on the on-farm practical side of your question. Additionally, we know that contaminant losses are very often episodic, so they tend to be lost at certain times and in certain places. So really targeting those high risk times and places is important. Minimising stock time, especially over winter on saturated and vulnerable soils, is critical. Using standoff where possible is important. Also, there's been quite a lot of research done that consistently shows that using alternative forages, pasture species, and particularly low protein feeds can make a difference. In Southland, planting catch crops to try and soak up that excess nitrogen from the system before it can be leached. Using low protein feeds, that's really around matching the supply and demand again in the system, and maintaining ground cover. So when there are plants growing, they can be taking up some of that excess nitrogen. Planting resowing as soon as possible, for example. And finally, on this wee subset, I would call it, of things that can be done, improving effluent and nutrient management systems. So in Southland, lowering ponds early before winter to make sure that storage is sufficient, using larger effluent areas, using low application rates, carefully monitoring soil moisture and rain forecasts so that effluent's not being applied at times when the risk is higher.
Yes. Yeah.
Supplementary to that, I think, for that answer, that is mainly issues that farmers can do, then, and a lot of that can be communicated by way of little pamphlets and brochures and so forth. But what I was really alluding to was more in the scientific work. How much more do you need to do to try and get a better handle on nitrates and what else can be done, essentially, I suppose, what I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, I guess, so through you, Chair, I'm lost in your question, which is, your previous one around what's really required to make a substantial change here. I would say that nitrogen's one of the trickier contaminants, and that particularly when we're looking at it in terms of groundwater, because it is diffuse discharges that are the issue for the most part here, which means that it's in large part a cumulative effects problem. So it is pretty hard to I think to address on a without considering limits or some type of cumulative effect approach to this.
Yeah, and I mean, this does come back to land use control and intensity, which is why both science and regulation are such critical tools in our toolbox. And so, as I've referred to, we've used our regulatory framework over time to tackle nitrate contamination, and it's very much, as I described, a story of evolution. Southland Water Land Plan tackled it in part as part of a suite of critical contaminants, but it doesn't specifically address nitrogen. Plan change to Utahi, we left the limit setting for that, but as you know, as to the earlier point made by Councillor Pemberton, a lot in the pipeline, but nothing in the here and now, in the regular, other than using the regulatory tools we've got right now. And so what the science program needs to be able to do now is very much support that limit setting work once we understand what that looks like from the government mid-year, noting that it's May already, so we hope that we will see that work soon.
John?
Hey, thanks. Would be interesting to work through what is this going to cost the region to tidy up. Now, the reason I ask that is because someone's going to foot the bill. But when we have levers taken away from us, and we'll just go through it, and I think it could show an accumulation of some challenges here. Farm plan's been pushed out. Consent's been pushed out 3 years. Now that all of a sudden removes a consented land use to Appendix N for farming, which all of a sudden puts a ceiling on it, which they have to work to. Diffuse discharge consents, they're gone, potentially gone.
Waiting on now.
Waiting on an answer, yep. So that's once again another lever for managing this. And When it comes to limit setting, obviously they haven't engaged with you guys to see what Southland thinks it should be. Is it yeah, okay, so this is a national limit setting. So I think over 3 or 4 to 5 years, you could accumulate what levers we haven't been able to use, what drivers there has been, what is that adding to the nutrient or nitrogen losses to groundwater in Southland. I know it's a big ask, but I think there's a big bill coming and we're going to have to pay it, and we weren't the ones that wrote the check out as a region.
He's taking most of the funding, but I'll still make a bit of noise. We cannot, like we do want to give this matter a greater priority, right? But how many priority things have we got to give money to with a income that's static? In fact, maybe depending on inflation, going backwards. So this is a bit negative, but the thing is, we've got to really look at where we do put money and where we're going to get our best bang for the buck for our community under sinking level systems. So, and maybe that we join up with all the rest of the people in the South Island and do the science. We've got a bit of power then, and get things going, and do a bit in here, a bit in Otago, and there's a bit more money to do things with. We've got to look at new ways of doing things, and that's going to be expensive. So I don't know. Yes, we want to take it as a greater priority, but we've got to be very careful that we don't end up broke. Well, we won't be here, but that's
The region will be broke.
yeah.
Thanks, Chairman. Follows on nicely from Councillor Gibson, actually. Two things. Referring to your question about greater priority. Priority, in my mind, immediately produces a list. And therefore, if we move this up the list, something must fall down the list. However, this is not an isolated issue as far as our work program, and so I can see opportunities for catchment conversations, and across a number of our teams that in their work and their combined work give greater priority, greater visibility to the work that needs to be done on this issue. It supports our integrated catchment management ideals, and our organisational ideals of not being siloed, and we have some very good catchment information and catchment maps and the like that we can actually introduce some really specific, because not all catchments are the same, as we know, and the nitrate issue across the catchments is the same in that regard. So as much as, yes, it's a really important issue, I think broadening it across the organisation rather than lifting it up in one specific area is what I'm suggesting.
Thank you, Chair. Now the politics of this. Farmers, a number of them have initiated this discussion with me, and some I've initiated it. And I would put this matter about where climate change was 12 years ago. There's a great degree of denial out there in the community. And whether it's denial because they don't believe it or denial because they don't want to have to engage in a very complex problem. But how do we get a more unified approach to dealing with this without frightening the horses, to do it in a credible way that we can actually move forward and identify some areas where we can work with some unanimity?
Yeah, a few years ago, we had reports that were authored by Tom Smelter, who's inputs for Science in New Zealand now, or AgResearch. And he said that to get to a state of order, we needed to reduce contaminants by huge amounts, 89 to 78%. Now, clearly that's a very long term. There, if we have a lot of innovation and a bit of sacrifice over time. But in the meantime, I think there are a number of tools, and you mentioned here earlier, you mentioned about things like putting fertiliser in the wintertime, getting greater use of standoff pads. These are things that John's group already know about. And there was that workshop that I presented a report on today about using these stacked mitigations, not just things like plant cleaning, but also, don't put fertiliser in September or in May when the ground is too wet and the grass is not growing. And keep your cows off saturated soils if you can for a little while. All of those things are already available to be done. So what we need to do, I think, is just to, instead of when we have these wintering field days, instead of just telling people to fence off their creeks and don't plant your Swedes and the swales, but think about things you can do to avoid nitrate contamination as well. So we do have mechanisms that are there that will provide some improvement in the short term. We might have to do more in the long term. So I would think that we do need to give this matter greater priority. Yes, the answer to that is yes. And there are things that we can do now to make things better, thinking that in the future we might have to do more, but at least, there are some things that we can do that can make it moment.
David.
Yeah. I mean, my gut feel is the way forward on this issue is to deal with people directly on the ground with practical solutions. We take people back to when at the Balanced Farm Environment Awards, a 90-day pond was put forward. And I was involved heavily with that meeting. A whole lot of farmers went in the door. When they were going in, they were going, not spending that sort of money on some sort of pond. This is ridiculous. And there was a lot of people in the room. When they left, they said, they got a point. And the vast majority of them went away and spent huge money on something because they were convinced of it. And once you convince people, then they get into the stuff. The sort of stuff that you're talking about, Morris, putting fertiliser on in the middle of winter is just daft. And it's not good management practice. And there's, peer pressure from farmers to lift that. But maybe we need to reiterate the sorts of things that would make a difference currently that everybody agrees to. Ewan's put forward some areas over 5 years where on one occasion that we exceeded it. And I guess I've heard about pulses and I don't understand that, but let's understand pulses when they do happen. And maybe they're not the tragedy that they might seem, but it gives you a big number if you take it over 5 years with one exceedance. If you work with people on the ground with the practical ways going forward, you see it's not easy to understand this, and then you reference it with some really good stuff that is happening in Canterbury where they have made some inroads. You bring those practical examples back, and not everything can be transferred, but you start the people on the ground, they see the issue, they identify it, they go, gee, I could do that. Will they listen before you actually run around with a big stick? Well, you can have the biggest police force in the world. When you convince people it's the right thing to do, it happens every day. They just get on and do it. That is by far the most efficient and quickest way to get change. So that's my.
Hearing those comments, I agree it's an efficient way to get change.
Absolutely.
Not sure it's the fastest way to get change. I would contest that because it relies on voluntary uptake in this case, because we're not in a position to regulate our way forward on this one. I believe that one tangible action that we could take is around providing support in partnership with TAs some, I'll use the term drinking water assurance to those individual households or communities that are currently carrying heightened levels of anxiety around, is my water currently safe to drink with nitrates at this level? This is not a all of Southland initiative. This is going to be targeting people who have expressed anxiety in specific hotspot regions. And it would identify those at-risk private and public groundwater supplies. It would enable testing and verification at those locations and give clear guidance to those people who feel at risk or have anxiety around this. I would see that as something that, in partnership with TAs, would reassure those people who are concerned, and it would also, if there was an actual issue, people would be alerted to that, and it would help us collect information, perhaps to a greater granular effect, to understand where the issue is. So that was one thing I would be keen to explore and understand what would be the implications, cost implications. And I think the cost implications are really important because we're being asked for more money on wilding pines, on possums, on flood banks, on transport infrastructure. The list of people coming to us begging or asking for more money for things seems quite extensive. So yeah, that's one thing I think would be worth exploring as a drinking water assurance program. But it would need to be done in conjunction with your TA partners wherever those hotspots are evident.
Yeah, two comments I wanted to make that are really well supported by both Councillor Rose and Morrison's comments. One, I think that yes, we need to give this greater priority, particularly with regards to our constituents who are at risk, and I give full support to that, and perhaps add that the health authorities will need to be included in that partnership conversation. And then back to Councillor Rose's comments that I wholeheartedly agree. You know, the efficiency and this sort of common sense decision making around this is really important. The reality is that the loss of particularly high levels of nitrate to groundwater represents a really inefficient conversion of nitrogen to plant biomass in a farm system, and we need to support people to maximise the efficiency of those systems, both for the environmental outcomes but also for the regional economic outcomes that it drives. And I think, you know, I'll perhaps just encourage us to think a little bit, you know, is winter simply the most nuanced that we can be? I don't think it is. We know a lot more about soil moisture and soil temperature than winter. We've got decades of historic data that can inform the appropriate season for application. You know, we've seen over the last years increasing use of helicopters to apply this product, knowing that it's occurring in September when soil temperatures are below 8, likely to be below 8 degrees in many places. It's just, it's never going to be efficiently used in that setting. So, yeah, I think there's some low-hanging fruit in that regard that could be addressed pretty quickly.
Yeah, I haven't got any hands, so I'll make my comment. Bring up the helicopter situation. It's not September, it's August, so you know, we've got people, I see the helicopters running all the time, and generally because they can't get a truck on the ground. It's too wet. A lot of farmers absolutely cringe seeing it because they know exactly what's going on. It's highly annoying. I'll stand up and debate that with any dairy farmer any day. That sitting here, you know, what can we do? I mean, the elephant in the room is the intensification. And we were going to have a talk about that with Plan Change Tuatahi. That was, I came here 10 years ago stating that's what I'm here for. I haven't had that discussion with the community. So you know, we're saying, oh, what can we do? And we can do this and that. You know, we do have some issues with intensification. But there has been a bit of de-intensification, is that the word? in regards to, I don't know, these, you know, there's meant to be 1 million less stock units in Southland through various, but we probably aren't seeing any effects of that as yet. It may take some years to come through with trees and bits and pieces, different changing land use types. But one, you know, looking at some of the stuff that you were talking about, what can we do? You know, one thing we can do, if we know that there is a positive thing by farmers doing it, is enabling it, not getting it tied up into regulatory framework that you must do this. And I mean, okay, we've got the wetlands discussion, but also around, and I stand to be corrected, you know, you talk about standoff pads, standoff areas and things like that. I think they are permitted if you build them a certain way. Is that correct or not? I just, in their water and land plan, I think there is a size and things.
Yes.
But it's actually encouraging those things down. Look, you can do this, you know, and especially being a dairy farmer, beef farmer. A lot of cattle, you know, I know that the difference would make. So there are things that we can encourage under a government that may indicate that there should be less regulation. And let's be very clear, and I've been at that public meeting from Mr. McClay. Minister McClay says farmers should be allowed to do whatever they want, generally because it's their land, apart from a couple of rules. Now that was, and Mr. Roy was there at the same meeting, and we clearly heard that. That means limit setting is going to look pretty interesting if that's their own, if they're going to put this regulation. So, yeah, so the tone, there's not going to be any more regulation with this government. So we just need to work on what can we do, what we can to enable better outcomes and encourage that, but also not put roadblocks up on the regulation. So, yeah, so one, prioritising things. The scare, like we have got an issue of priority, but I'm not going to sort of take it away from other things that we're dealing with. This isn't going to go away. This is just one of many things that need to be sorted, and then probably we don't want people drinking high nitrate water. That is, no, I'm not saying taking away from the fact that there's multiple things that we're going to sort out, make sure we've got resilience for our, you know, for our communities in the future. So I'm very wary of making something priority and then we'll forget about this and then that problem flares up in the future. Just so I'm just putting that in context.
So building on those set of ideas, Jeremy, one potential pathway is to work with partners, and I'm thinking Thriving Southland, catchment groups, feds, MFE, potentially MPI maybe, to develop hotspot action plans. To understand or engage with land managers, land users in those specific, very focused regions that we know are more problematic, and to focus our efforts on building an understanding of what is the nature of this challenge, the likely source, and to perhaps accelerate in a local in a local fashion, what we understand are the good management practices, including those that we understand can be actioned quickly and easily, albeit with funding. If things are permitted, you know, making sure people understand what is permitted and not permitted. Giving buy-in, if you like, from the people who are directly affected in those hotspot locations with the people who are potentially also contributing to the issue. And you could even prioritise, we're going to, rather than tackle all hotspots at once, you can pick 3 of the most challenging hotspots and seek to develop and get partner buy-in to the concept of a hotspot action plan for those very focused, prioritised areas, and understanding what's that going to cost us.
Thank you. Just picking up on Phil's point there. I think there's already a number of groups around Southland, like Belf and Endell. I would really promote what have we learned as a council from that engagement. Where are the roadblocks? We all know where they are, and why. I guess my challenge is if the central government's willing to bend the rules to suit their politics, why the hell are we not bending our rules to do what's right for the environment? I know, Hayley, there's a struggle for regulatory around wetlands and such like, and I fully understand that's not dealing with groundwater, but if we're going to go and support communities, you might only get 70% of what you're looking for. But I think that's a really important thing moving forward, is that everybody's getting to tick a box to move in the right direction. So yeah, just backing up what Phil says, but sort of pointing out we've been here for some time, and I think we need to find ways of moving forward on some stuff.
Yeah, so yes, obviously I consider it needs greater priority, but I suppose one of the things that we haven't touched on, you know, from a farming perspective, we all talk about profitability being incredibly important, what we do, and it is. But if we look at those three models that thriving, engaged in around beyond regulation, all those three models were modelled around lower footprint with greater profitability. So to the point's been made around efficiency, there's a lot of opportunity out there to actually have lower footprint models that are actually more profitable. So I don't think this is unachievable, and it is a mechanism around engagement that you've talked about. Bill. But it's a positive story.
I do have to ask, traceability is proving to be hard, but obviously the burning platform being that it's not a up and down spiky, it's been a trajectory up, being that everything's consented up there and permitted activity. And that my understanding is Gore will be more focused on finding clean water rather than addressing the issue, understandably. Are we as a council interested in actually just trying to work through 20 years' time the question comes up, we don't say, we don't know. At least, we're not looking for prosecutions or anything like that, but I think this is something that we do need to dig deeper on to scratch the surface. Is there an appetite with this?
So through your chair, as you're aware, there was a compliance investigation and they couldn't find a very clear single source to put through their procedures on that. So that then got handed over to the science team. Now, because it's such a significant issue for so many people, science have been undertaking an investigation on that. As you've commented on, part of that issue has been somewhat remedied by the fact that Gore are diluting their supply there, but there's still an issue in the as well as areas. And we also want to make sure that we don't see an issue develop in the area from which they're getting their dilution supply from too. So we are working with Gore on that. So there's a phased science investigation that is underway. The team were out, I think it was this week, doing some sampling up that way. We're really keen to talk to those that know that area very well to better understand land use and land practices in that area and how that may have changed over time. So we're working through a science approach, but it does take time to pull that information together. It's also not cheap, which is why we do it in a phased approach. So tapping into some of the easier tools that Ewan was talking about, then we'll stop, reassess, and then look at whether or not we need to invest more in how we do that. So all I can say is that that the investigation is ongoing, but it will be like a 6 to 12 month kind of time period for science to start to come up with hopefully some answers, but at least a bit more.
Just for Sam sums up, and going back to Eric's comment about 12 years ago about the climate change discussion. I don't know how many years ago around the Gore district, tried to get control of about 6,000 hectares around the water supply, and all hell broke loose. and went through and looked at it, backed on. Well, we're sitting here today with the issue. And so I'm not saying it was a wee bit back then they were trying to protect the water system. I don't know how they could have done it, but the reality is that this has been trying to protect some of these water sources over the years. But because of the uproar from the agricultural sector, they backed off. So, but now we're dealing with the problem coming even more, and we're going to do something and try and work this out. Because the community here is probably asking questions now, some serious questions. Anyway, yeah.
Before I hand over to Rob, I'm just going to make a couple of quick points, if that's all right, through you, Chair. First of all, obviously this is a workshop and not a decision-making committee meeting, but we'd just like an indication. Is, a lot of you have spoken that you do think we should give this matter greater priority. Is there anyone that feels that we shouldn't? Have we got a degree of need to talk?
If I can add, I've got to be careful of prioritising. I'm just saying that if we prioritise something, I want to know what's not being done. Because you fix it, you might say, "Oh, great here," and then all of a sudden, 5 years down the track, where did this come from? We know we've got a pretty good idea. So I'm just need to know how that works and be very clear on that. That's my own.
That's my point earlier.
And the point I was going to make is that the whole philosophical shift to integrated catchment management this is part of that. So ICM and ICM-led approaches help mitigate this as well. So if I was to promote prioritising, all I'm saying is it will just bring focus to what we're already doing in the ICM space. Now, if we're going to do wetlands, if we get clearance to shift the rules on what wetlands take, then the automatic reduction is, right, let's look at the wetlands that are going to deliver impact where there are hospitals. So I guess what we're doing is we're just overlaying and perhaps using this as an opportunity to bring increased focus to perhaps some of our existing thoughts on what does ICM look like for Southland moving forward. And also, I think at the same time, we need to invest in reassuring the public or those sectors of the public that are spooked, and rightly so, spooked by what they do or do not understand by the science of this.
So I'll change my words a wee bit after that conversation. So this is about actually how do we ensure we give greater focus, I guess, is a good way of putting it. I think that Councillor Morrison talked about that, and I've jotted down a few things here around looking at how do we some thoughts around drinking water assurance with our TA colleagues and a bit of a partnership. Actually, let's give the community assurance. It's going to be very much a partnership, and we'll have to look at what that looks like. But also explore ways of how do we make it easy for the right things to happen. We're doing that with wetlands at the moment. What else do we need to be doing in that space to make it happen? Also working with partners to develop a hotspot action plan to build understanding and what are the appropriate mitigation to apply in those action plans. And I think we can use the experience of Balfour and Edendale in that process. Again, we've already got our teams out doing work in that space, so this is around ensuring they're focusing on this sort of thing. And I think picking up the theme of integrated catchment management, this is very much the vision of how do we work in these catchments on the priority issues we've got up there. Nitrates is one in a number of catchments. So I think that's the picture I'm picking up. I'm not seeing anyone shaking heads. We'll go away and do a bit more thinking about this and come back as to how we build this into our programs. And this is a live discussion. This ain't the end of the conversation, but that's where I'm seeing. And
just could you also inbuild the ongoing monitoring as well as the mitigations?
That's a given.
Ongoing the localised
and also. Just add to that, we'll finish this investigation, the science investigation, to see if we can find some answers to the issues at Gore. But also engaging with Te Mataurawa and with health actually was this, what's the broader conversation in Southland to address this issue. I think there's some conversations with government we can be having as well. You know, I think we need to be making sure that actually one size doesn't fit all, and we need to have some Southland specific, you know, sort of initiatives that's provided for and anything coming down from central government.
One thing that number 4 talks about regulatory levers, and as a government, those are difficult. You can really work to look at what options there are. So I'm talking about making things easier to do. But, you know, there's some things that we can do that are not too difficult to impose that we could consider. We talked before about applying fertiliser in the winter time. You know, every good farmer knows that it's a thing to do, but people still do it. How can we? Is something we can do in it?
Well, sometimes response variation. Yeah, look, spring of 2024 was just came after a bad winter, and all the baleage was used. People were feeding stock on their roadways, and there wasn't another visible option to feed your animals. So people put, and I know people that put nitrogen on urea 3 times in totally unsuitable conditions. They did that because they were desperate. Now, that doesn't condone what they did, but when you have very, very few options, that's possibly the only, and they were just hoping for a break in the weather.
That just gave that as an example. But
Yeah.
There are
stupid people as well.
To do, maybe that's part of their education program. Right, what I'm saying is that at some stage, some lever might be able to be.
I suppose it's a wee bit further to Morris's point, is that, and Jeremy, you talked about the likelihood of a regulatory framework not being in place, but some behaviours are actually being influenced by the possibility of regulation. And so, you know, people trying to establish or protect footprint based on what may happen. So there's that sort of thinking and that sort of action happening in the background too.
Thank you.
It's going so well.
Well done.
That's right.
We're going in circles, and this all comes back to farm plans, and are we approaching farm plans the right way? Is there some other way of getting the community on board through farm plans? Because to Morris's point, to Eric's point, to a lot of what we talked about, best management practice, farm plan needs to be seen as an educational tool for environmental decisions and accounting for farmers. Have we exhausted all avenues other than legislation to get farmers on?
Yeah, good point.
As we understand it, the government's saying we still going to need freshwater farm plans. They're pushed out the date. They are going to have to be informed, include Appendix N information. I guess we've got to push really hard as that endures and doesn't get flipped out through the process.
We need to find something as a lever.
We've also got a job to do with a government that's absolutely focusing on increasing production, and the reality of some of that decision making environmentally they've just ignored, and we need to get that message across as well. So we need to work to sort of get some unanimity across the whole spectrum of people who make decisions. Otherwise, we're going to get the elephant stomp on anything we do if it's not accepted on a national basis.
Within a hotspot action plan, you could encourage voluntary uptake of Appendix N farm plans. If people are concerned for their social license to continue doing what they're doing, I would really be encouraging us to consider promoting that voluntary uptake. Even it may not be mandatory, but if you can demonstrate within a hotspot action plan that you are leaning into the issue and taking some ownership of your contribution, I would have thought that's an option for us to consider with partners around those action plans.
All good. Right. wind up. Thank you very much for all that.
Thank you.
For the input. Yeah. And, we'll close the workshop.
Yes.
Yes, please.
If we,
See in the live stream.
Yeah.
thank you, councillors.
Yeah, well, there we go.